This is going to be tricky, and I want to make the disclaimer right up front that I don't have a degree in literary history. I'm not a historian in the sense of being well-rounded in my knowledge of the 19th century. What I have is 13 years of intensive study into one particular obscure author. So everything that touched Mathew Franklin Whittier's life and Abby Poyen Whittier's life, I've learned by proxy, by osmosis. But there's a lot of things I don't know, so I'm ignorant about certain things. I have to go by my notes. I have to use the internet and so on. So with that being said, what we're going to do is to go through point for point here a review that Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote upon seeing Charles Dickens give a reading in 1867, his second trip to America. Mathew signed with his star signature, the asterisk. This is in the piece itself is signed December 20, 1867, and it was published in the January 4th, 1868 Portland Transcript. This is 18 years after Margaret Fuller's death, but Mathew used the star before, even for book reviews. He used it afterwards for years and years, especially in the Portland Transcript. He signed with a star. So that was also Mathew signing with a star in the New York Tribune from 1844 until 1846, which is the period when scholars mistakenly believed that Margaret Fuller was using that signature. She used it after she went to Europe. She used it in a handful of cases as the literary editor, and she also would insert her own thoughts into Mathew's writing. So in that sense, she was the writer, but only in that sense. So here we have the same author who was writing in the New York Tribune with a star, now writing in 1868 about having seen Charles Dickens give a reading. Now, there's a lot more history to this. You probably know that I'm convinced and have good evidence to support my convictions that Mathew and Abby were the original authors of A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens merely reworked it in a hurry and dumbed it down and secularized it for public consumption, but he did not author it. He didn't come up with the ideas. So Mathew appears to have, with all the clues in, he appears to have handed that manuscript over to Charles Dickens in Boston in January 1842 during Dickens' first tour of America. Now, we don't know what the agreement was, what Mathew told him. Mathew was grieving. It was something he and Abby had worked on together with kind of, I won't say grandiose, but with great hopes of changing the world with it, of bringing each reader through a conversion experience, I believe. And Mathew conceived the idea that the only way that goal could be achieved was to induce a famous author like Dickens to publish it, see? So he may have said in his grief, remember Mathew was deep in grief at this time. It had been a matter of months since he'd lost Abby. So he might have said in a fit of admiration for Dickens, because he did admire Dickens, and in grief, kind of being numb, he may have said, do with it what you will. Possible he said that. Or he may have said, see what you think of this. We just don't know what the agreement was. There is a record that Mathew wrote him. Dickens acknowledged a letter from Mathew that's in Dickens' correspondence, published correspondence, but we don't know what was in the letter. So either way, to me, it's like taking candy from a baby. Dickens definitely took advantage of Mathew Franklin Whittier. Mathew may have been starstruck when it first came out and may have felt that Dickens did a wonderful thing in publishing his and Abby's manuscript and how wonderful that was. But Mathew had a very low self-esteem. He was the better writer. He was the crisper writer. He was the more moral writer. He had a longer track record of publishing. He had a longer track record of publishing social reform literature, including a novel. All this has come out in my research. So Mathew was the senior writer, definitely, no question. And he was the better writer, but he bowed to Dickens' great reputation. Well, Dickens got his reputation because, in my opinion, he stole the ideas of other authors, more moral authors, and secularized them and popularized them and made them titillating for the public. And it was that titillated public who wanted to read sordid stories, but they wanted to be able to excuse the fact that they were reading sordid stories in the Victorian era because it was supposedly social reform literature, see? So therefore it was okay. And he became wildly popular doing this, and that was his power and his fame, not because of his prowess as a writer, in my opinion. So Mathew's feeling about Dickens went up and down. He just wasn't sure. And the reason he wasn't sure is because half of Dickens' stuff wasn't his ideas. It wasn't his work. And that's the confusion that comes in when you have a massive plagiarist, is that, you'll just about decide that he's, no big shakes, and suddenly he'll come out with something excellent. Well, it wasn't his. So this is the problem. And there were people, but not very many people. The public couldn't come out and say, oh no, Dickens didn't write these things. A few people did, and we'll get to that in just a second. So we have instances of Mathew writing about Dickens, and it's on this side and it's on that side. It goes back and forth. So here, writing as the star for the Tribune, and this is not Margaret Fuller, in the July 1845 edition, he's writing about Thomas Hood, poet Thomas Hood, and he says, Hood never became corrupted into a hack writer. This shows great strength under his circumstances, whatever they were. I don't know what they were. Dickens has fallen, and Sue, which is Eugene Sue, French author, is falling. For few men can sell themselves by inches without losing a cubit from their stature. I would guess that's a biblical reference. But he says that Dickens has fallen into a hack writer as of mid-1845, okay? And, of course, the Christmas Carol was published at the end of 1843, so basically, ever since Dickens published his book, he's fallen into being a hack writer. That's Mathew's opinion of 45. But then there's other places where he extols Dickens, and in particular, it comes in after David Copperfield, which was 1849-1850, published in serial form. But there was a literary critic, a journalist named Thomas Powell, who said and demonstrated with comparison extended quotes that Dickens had plagiarized David Copperfield from The Career of Puffer Hopkins by Cornelius Mathews. And that's in a book called The Living Authors of England. Well, scholars, critics, and scholars, and Dickens himself trashed Powell. Dickens smeared him, and I don't think it was honest. I think it was a dishonest smear, but because of Dickens' power and authority and fame, everybody believed him. I mean, he just absolutely destroyed the man's reputation, and everybody believed that. But I believe Powell because he gives evidence, Well, it so happens that Mathew used to write under Cornelius Mathews when Cornelius Mathews was the editor, the second half of Yankee Doodle magazine, humor magazine in New York, 1847. Mathew was a heavy contributor to that, so he knew Cornelius Mathews, but perhaps he didn't ever read this book, The Living Authors of England, or perhaps he didn't believe, Powell. Perhaps he believed Dickens because, I don't have it here in front of me, but, if you go back into the history and read what Dickens said about Powell, he really personally destroyed his reputation. I don't think any of it was honest. So Mathew may have believed that because he had been a fan. Mathew had been a fan of Dickens, Martin Chuzzlewit, and so on. He wrote to his brother about Martin Chuzzlewit. So he had been a fan of Dickens, obviously, before he handed over that manuscript. So he started, after David Copperfield, he started thinking, oh, actually Dickens was, a great writer and I was mistaken and so on. Well, it went back and forth like that. And I pulled out some quotes, but I'm not going to go into them. I'm going to start right into this. And I don't have a physical copy, but I do have a nice big PDF that I got from the library, which I'm going to use on the screen here. So it's called Dickens Readings. It's written for the Portland Transcript, and it is signed with a star, which I'll show you on the screen also. It's signed New York, December 20, 1867. Now, before we get started, I've demonstrated a number of times that Mathew would tell his readers and posterity secrets about whatever he was writing about in code with coded references. And one of the ways he used coded references was in his quotes. So if he had a quote and he eliminated part of the quote with ellipses, you can look up that quote and look in the omitted part of the quote, and there's your code. Or he would quote something, and then you look up that quote, and it's either before or immediately after the quote is the message. And I've got way too many examples of this for it to be chance. This is not magical thinking. This is not me reading anything into it. I guarantee you I've got way too many examples, and it's way too specific. If you read my paper on the Raven, you will see good examples in there. It's clearly not chance, and I'm clearly not reading this into it. I know all the skeptical arguments, and sophistry gets really exhausting and really disgusting to me, and I'll fight it, but it's like dueling with shadows. You can't ever beat somebody who's engaging in sophistry. What you can do is say, you're engaging in sophistry, and call them on it. And of course, they won't admit it. I had one guy actually argue with me about the definition of sophistry with sophistry. And I told him that. And of course, it went, it's impossible. But anyway, I'm going to get through this here. But there is one instance where Mathew, who sounds like a fan, this sounds like a positive review, but he uses that technique, and he uses it specifically exactly the way we would expect him to do. Mathew leaves tributes to Abby. He knows that Abby was the more important co-author of A Christmas Carol, and he leaves her a tribute, and we'll see that. So I'm going to begin. You may perhaps like to print a few notes on the readings of Mr. Dickens in this city. Very much has been said on the subject already, but it is one of which the admirers of Boz do not readily tire. The critics of the New York papers have, of course, all expressed themselves repeatedly. With the exception of a few of the smaller sort, they have spoken favorably, enthusiastically. The articles in the Tribune, especially, have been so genial and in such a Dickens-like manner that they must have surprised and gratified the subject of them if they came to his notice. It is undoubtedly true that some persons in each of Mr. Dickens' audiences are there merely from the motive of curiosity. To almost anyone, the fact that he has so much as seen the greatest living writer of fiction is something to be pleasantly remembered. It is also true that to sitters in the remote parts of such a hall as the Steinway, hearing is sometimes difficult, and appreciation of the wonderful expressiveness of Mr. Dickens' face quite impossible. In spite of these things, however, each successive reading has shown how thoroughly the mass of the people love the writer and delight in the reader. For myself, I anticipated these readings with most intense interest. From the day I first read David Copperfield down to the era of R. Wilfer and his vivacious daughters, I have felt, and so have thousands for that matter, a sort of personal attachment and obligation to Dickens. Now, before I go on, Mathew was reading Dickens since Martin Chuzzlewit. So why does he start here with David Copperfield? Why does he say, from the day I first read David Copperfield? That's because before then, he had pretty much decided that Dickens was a hack writer. But after David Copperfield, he changed his mind. That's why he's starting with David Copperfield here. But David Copperfield was plagiarized. See, so that's where Mathew has been fooled. Mathew got fooled all the time. He got fooled again. Now, he has a sort of personal attachment and obligation to Dickens. That's a coded reference. That does not, see, anytime Mathew says something that just sort of sounds good and doesn't seem to have any context, it's just thrown in there, it sounds like an exaggeration. It sounds like poetical language. It isn't. Mathew doesn't use that kind of language. Every word that Mathew puts in is meaningful. He doesn't use any vague generalizations or, things like that. So when he says a sort of personal attachment and obligation to Dickens, he's making a coded reference to the fact that he wrote A Christmas Carol. He co-authored A Christmas Carol with Abby. He handed A Christmas Carol over to Dickens, and Dickens obligated him in a particular sense by publishing it. Mathew still feels that way. He still feels that the great Dickens obligated him by publishing and spreading across the world his and Abby's manuscript. He shouldn't feel that way because, again, he was the senior writer, definitely. He was the senior writer in matters of all the things that are admired in A Christmas Carol, including social reform, and he was a better writer. But he has a very low self-esteem, and Dickens is famous, and he still, in 1868, feels not only a personal attachment, because there is a personal connection, but an obligation to Dickens. I go on. It says, Pickwick has enlivened many a sad or vacant hour, and then he quotes, till at length, in sorrow's spite, Samuel makes thee laugh outright. But it isn't possible, within the limits of a newspaper article, to give a catalog of all the characters in all of Dickens' books, and nothing less than that would do justice to the subject. Dickens is here, and this is the night of the Christmas Carol and Sergeant Buzzfuzz. So he's picked out A Christmas Carol as the first of two of many. Now he tells us that he, in fact, is way up in the gallery where he had said it's impossible to see Dickens' expression. Now note that, because later on he extols Dickens' expressions. The light aerial gallery in which we were glad to get seats was very lofty and, were you ever up in a balloon, extremely ethereal. On its inmost verge we waited. I need not tell you how Dickens steps or what sorts of clothes and jewelry he wears. All that has been reiterated and is perhaps, quote, really of no consequence to most of us. Now, I'm going to stop, and I've got to go. I've got a new shelf unit over here. I'm dyslexic, so I'm pointing the wrong way. I've got a new shelf unit over there, and in there is a book about Louisa that includes a quote by Louisa May Alcott of when she saw Dickens give a reading in, I think it was London. I'm going to go get it and read that for you. I think I've got it marked out. Okay, so this is Louisa May Alcott, and she is seeing Dickens on stage giving a reading. Louisa spent 7 weeks in London, taking in all that the city had to offer. She was perhaps most grateful for the chance to indulge her ongoing fascination with Dickens. She spent a day eagerly crisscrossing the city in search of real-life locations that had surfaced in the pages of Martin Chuzzlewit, Dombey and Son, and David Copperfield. She even managed to secure admission to a reading by the author himself, and doubtlessly looked forward to the event with expectations that could only be disappointed. Now that's the author's little insertion. He's setting us up for the fact that she was disappointed, and he's setting us up with the idea that her expectations were too high because she had put him on a pedestal. Well, that's John Matson. This is Eden's Outcast by John Matson. Well, that was John Matson, but it doesn't fit with what follows. And disappointed they were from the very moment that the great man appeared on stage, bedecked with gaudy rings and sporting foppish curls, repelled by the sight of his false teeth and the sound of his voice, which was that of, quote, a worn-out actor. Louisa now had a clear image of the kind of literary celebrity she did not want to become. Well, there's a footnote there. I won't go into where he got that. But in other words, she expected the person who had supposedly written these works, and what she got was the plagiarist who was a worldly, crass character. This is what's going to happen every time you look into Charles Dickens. Looking for the author of A Christmas Carol, you're going to find, a scoundrel, basically, okay, a man of low moral character. So I'm going to move on here. The light aerial gallery in which we were glad to get seats was very lofty and, were you ever up in a balloon, extremely ethereal. On its inmost verge we waited. I need not tell you how Dickens steps or what sorts of clothes and jewelry he wears. All that has been reiterated and is perhaps, quote, really of no consequence to most of us. I think he's defending Dickens still, see, against those kinds of commentaries. Having read in a Boston letter that the enunciation of the first sentence of the carol assured his success in Boston, we were dismayed at perceiving nothing remarkable in that half-dozen words. Well, over here I have a replica of A Christmas Carol. I'm going to pull that out, and let's look at the first half-dozen words. Here we go. Marley was dead to begin with. That's 6 words. That's the first sentence. That's the first half-dozen words. This is the statement of the believer in the afterlife. This was written by 2 people who are firmly convinced of the existence of the afterlife, and it was written as a proof story, see? So they're starting out with their conviction that the afterlife is real. Okay, in other words, that when Marley comes, he was not alive. He had been dead 7 years ago, and he was a ghost. What Mathew is saying is that he felt no conviction in Dickens' voice when he read this statement of belief in the afterlife. It means that Mathew was acknowledging that Dickens himself was a skeptic in the matters of spiritualism in the afterlife. He thought this was a ghost story, whereas he knew that when Abby wrote it like the movie Ghost, where everything supernatural was intended to be authentic, because the writer of that story, Bruce Joel Rubin, was a deep student of Kundalini Yoga, and he knew that all of the elements that he put into the movie Ghost were also real. See, well, that's what the first 6 words in A Christmas Carol is. It's not written in imagination any more than the poem The Raven was written in imagination, up to the point where the raven enters the room. That was all literal. Well, you know, the writers that really wrote A Christmas Carol, they meant what they were saying. Having read in a Boston letter that the enunciation of the first sentence of the carol assured his success in Boston, we were dismayed at perceiving nothing remarkable in that half-dozen words, because Dickens didn't believe in the afterlife. But when the reader came to the paragraph, "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner," we knew who it was that spoke. That means that's Dickens. Dickens is Scrooge. And that's what Mathew is saying in here, that he could feel the conviction in Dickens' voice when he read that, because that's him. See? Then he says, and this gets tricky. I've read this a million times, and I'm pretty darn sure I'm right about all this. There's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does. This is one of Mathew's technically true statements, which is actually neutral. It sounds like praise, but it actually isn't praise. It's just a neutral statement. There's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does. Mathew did not write as Dickens did. Dickens had to go in and completely revise Mathew and Abby's writing style, especially Mathew's, to suit himself. And if you go into the handwritten draft of A Christmas Carol, which is the Morgan Library and Museum, and it's online, you can look at it, and if you zoom in, it's very difficult to see what was there before, but if you look carefully, what you'll see is that 90% of the time, Dickens, he took somebody else's crisp writing and fluffed it out. He secularized it, and he fluffed it out, possibly to make it longer, because it wasn't long enough to publish as a novella. I don't know, but he went in, and where there was 2 words or 3 words, he added 3 more, see, to make it 6 words, So nobody writes as Dickens does, but the author of A Christmas Carol was not Dickens and did not write as Dickens did. I've got many examples of Mathew giving these kind of statements that just sit there and make you think they're praise, but they really aren't. He did that with Poe also. And now, surely there's nobody who can read like him. One of the things that Mathew, signing as the letter B for Bertram, I think it was, one of the things he wrote in a letters to the editor, he said that when he personally saw Edgar Allan Poe reading The Raven, he says he read it as it will never be read again, or something like that. And Poe had died recently. So in a manner that will never be repeated, that was the phrase, you know. Well, yeah, technically, since Poe was dead, he read it in a manner that will never be repeated, but it wasn't praise. As a matter of fact, he probably thought it was awful. It says, and now, surely there's nobody who can read like him. We recalled our first perusal of the book and beheld, now listen to this, we recalled our first perusal of the book, meaning the first time that he got his hands on the published copy. Obviously not the first time he saw the manuscript, because he wrote it. And here's a quote, another morn risen on mid-noon. Now, that's not attributed. I had no idea where it came from. Fortunately, you can Google these things. This is my scholarship, is the internet, see? So I looked it up. This comes from Wordsworth's The Prelude or Growth of a Poet's Mind in a section entitled Cambridge and the Alps. And I'm going to put it on the screen from a copy of the original, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to show you. This is his tribute to Abby. What he means is that when he got the printed copy of this book, it was as though Abby had returned to him emotionally. Okay? And we're going to see that. That streamlet whose blue current works its way between romantic Dovedale's spiry rocks, pried into Yorkshire dales or hidden tracts of my own native region, and was blessed between these sundry wanderings with a joy above all joys that seemed another morn risen on mid-noon, blessed with the presence, friend, of that sole sister, her who hath been long dear to thee also, thy true friend and mine, now, after separation desolate, restored to me, such absence that she seemed a gift then first bestowed. He's saying that when that published copy, when he first got his hands on it, it was as though Abby had returned to him. Fezziwig's ball was admirably managed and was a complete success. In came, quote, Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. The story of the Christmas dinner at the Cratchits was delightfully told, and nothing in mimic life could be more pathetic than the expression of Bob Cratchit when he exclaims, my little, little child, my little child. Now, Mathew and Abby wrote A Christmas Carol just after the death of their son Joseph, who was 11 months old. This apparently was an old soul, they felt. The poem A Child Asleep that Elizabeth Barrett Browning published, she published it actually first in 1840 in Finden's Tableau, and I'll show you that right now. I'll go get it. This is Finden's Tableau, 1840. It was a coffee table book. And this poem called The Dream, or A Dream, I can never remember which it is, appears the first item in here. And it's called The Dream, and there's an illustration, which I think I can carefully show here, of a child sleeping. But the illustration doesn't match because the poem has the child in heaven with angels, and these are like knights and ladies and stuff like that. But the poem, The Dream, shows up on the very first page. That was written by Mathew and Abby about their son Joseph. And I think that the backstory, what I feel and extrapolate is the backstory on that is that a minister or priest had come, and Abby was being persecuted as a witch. She was seen as a heretic because she understood the esoteric teachings and knew the occult, astrology, palm reading, and so on. And the minister or priest apparently wanted to bless Joseph while he was sleeping, probably to protect him from his parents. See, they were heretics. And Mathew and Abby were furious at him. And what they told him was, he should be blessing us because he's an old soul, and as he's sleeping, he's in heaven right now. If anybody should bless anybody, he should be blessing you, not vice versa. Well, if you read between the lines in that poem, that's what's being said in there. But Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, messed with it. But if you look at it closely and compare it stanza by stanza, you'll find that she messed with it. Each time she published it, she went back to the original. She didn't write it and then modify that, for the second printing in 1844. She went back to the original for 1844. You can extrapolate that by what's in the first one and what's in the second one. And I actually put together the stanzas that look like they're original to make one single poem. That's for another day. Maybe I'll do that someday. It's in my paper. If you read the paper about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and how she plagiarized from Mathew Franklin Whittier, that analysis is in there. Now, so when he says, I'll read this section again. The story of the Christmas dinner at the Cratchits was delightfully told. Abby would have written that section. And nothing in mimic life could be more pathetic than the expression of Bob Cratchit when he exclaims, "My little, little child, my little child." Mimic life means in writing, but what he's saying is it brought back to his mind the original event. He's saying nothing could be more pathetic in the book than the actual experience of having lost his child. And the circumstances for that was that they were being persecuted. They had been driven out of Dover, New Hampshire, which they had eloped to because they were publishing abolitionist letters in the editor, and they'd figured them out. They were signing as Kappa, Lambda, and Mu. Kappa's a water sprite. Abby was known between the two of them as a river sprite or a water sprite. That's what he would call her. Lambda is the symbol that used to be used on Spartan shields, and Mathew was very guarded with his emotions, so that was kind of his symbol. And then Mu was little Joseph, unborn at that time. See, when they first started, they got figured out, and they were driven from Dover, New Hampshire. They went back to Amesbury, Massachusetts, where his brother and sister lived, but they apparently lived in some very poor housing connected with the mill workers. And they were being persecuted. I have evidence that when Mathew was out, they were publishing a little newspaper at the time, the Salisbury Monitor. You can find it online from Bonham's auction house. And when he was at the printers, the girls, probably the mill worker girls, would come and stone the house. They would throw rocks at the house. And I think they would probably throw rocks through the windows. And she was terrified that they were going to set the place on fire, and they must have been screaming horrible things at her while she was huddled there with their little boy. See, so he mentions this in the newspaper, and so that he had to get them out. Well, he'd been corresponding with an abolitionist named Thomas Chandler in Michigan, some miles outside Detroit, and he finally decided he would go out there and see if they couldn't move out there. He was having trouble getting employment other than just farming, see. Well, he went out there, and it takes maybe a couple weeks. When he came back, he found that Joseph had died of scarlet fever. And that's a long story, too. I think I know how that happened. But this is when he would have been saying, "My little, little child, my little child." His mind went back to the very moment that he came back from his trip to Michigan and found that little Joseph had died, see. So he's not praising Dickens' reading at all. What he's doing is going back in time to what actually happened that he wrote about, see, because that was what they wrote about. All right. The trial scene from Pickwick was brimful of fun, and so forth and so on. I don't know that I need to go too much further into this, because he talks about the other characters that Dickens read. Now we go down and says, Mr. Dickens' power of facial expression is wonderful, but he doesn't know. How would he know? Because he's already told us that the people in the balcony can't see his expression, and he's already told us that he's up there in the nosebleed section. So it's just because he still admires Dickens or desperately wants to believe that Dickens is a great author, because he has no idea that not only did he use Mathew's work, but he's used a whole bunch of other people's work. For example, he talks about Pickwick here, but Pickwick was, all he did was to take Robert Seymour's illustrations and flesh them out. Again, he secularized them, he dumbed it down, and he sensationalized it, but none of that was his ideas, see? And as I read between the lines, Robert Seymour tried to get Dickens to admit that it was his work and was unable to and committed suicide. It's a pretty sordid business. This is not a nice guy, this Charles Dickens. Then he says, it is seen in the stolidity of Starley, the grief of Bob Cratchit, the gobbling of Toots. But he can't see it from up there, so I don't know how he dare suggest such a thing. Then he says, the soul of good humor so shone in his face that it was impossible to think it artificial. Well, this is what he's struggling with himself. He knows that Dickens is a phony, but he can't admit it to himself. So even though he can't actually see Dickens' facial expressions, he's desperately trying to convince himself that the soul of good humor so shone in his face that it was impossible to think it artificial. It is pleasanter, too, to suppose it was genuine mirth, which the reader really shared with his audience. Well, it was pleasanter to assume that, all right, because the alternative was awful. The alternative means that he's a phony, which is what turned off Louisa May Alcott. He's a big phony. See, she saw him up close and she said, with all his flashy rings and everything, said, this guy's a big phony. And it really turned her off. Well, Mathew, sitting up in the nosebleed section, desperately doesn't want to admit that to himself. So he says, it is pleasanter, too, to suppose it was genuine. See? Here's the last paragraph. Some of the Sunday papers have been suggesting, with a great deal of patriotic sarcasm, that Mr. Dickens should read from Martin Chuzzlewit. They think the proposition a great joke. That's in which he started satirizing America towards the end. It is probable that the selections are permanently arranged, but if extracts from that book were to be read, they would be received good-naturedly. He's trying to apologize for Dickens. Not because we are such incorrigible flunkies as those papers make us out to be, but because sensible people understand and appreciate some of the characters in that book, meaning that we can admit, our flaws as a country. We laugh at Stiggins and Honorable Samuel Slumkey of Slumkey Hall. We smile at such native productions as Reverend Joseph Bellamy Stoker. And are we going to get in a passion about the Jefferson Brink of 20 years ago? And there's the star signature. So Mathew is defending Dickens. See, he's totally confused about this guy because he can see that he's a materialist, an atheist, a worldly man who doesn't believe in the life after death. His reading about Fezziwig's Ball was admirably managed, and yet it was a complete success. Well, that's oxymoronic for a man who's supposed to be, world famous reader and author. If he managed it admirably, it was not a complete success. It can't be both of those things at the same time. So Mathew was totally confused. And the confusion is the same confusion we have today as it's becoming known that Dickens tried to have his wife, Catherine, committed to an insane asylum to get her out of the way so that he could continue with his affair, the one that he sanctimoniously denied in what's called the violated letter. But the most damning evidence about Dickens that I found is his readings toward the end, like after this period when he went back, he was reading from the murder scene, the scene of from Oliver Twist of Bill Sikes murdering his girlfriend Nancy. He practiced it at home. He read it for audiences, and he got totally into it. He got so into it that it became a threat to his health, and he had a stroke. So, and I think they think maybe he died as a result of it. And even though his doctor forbid him from performing it on stage for his health, he did it at home just because he got off on it so much. That's really who Dickens is. See, Dickens didn't read passages from A Christmas Carol to himself at home in an elevated spiritual state, He read this sordid business about the murder over and over because that's the kind of person he actually was. That person could not possibly have written A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks. It's utterly impossible. So what we have is a myth. a very powerful, very deeply entrenched myth, which academia as well as the public totally bought into. There may be a few people questioning it. Louisa May Alcott did, but nobody mentions that. See, it's just kind of passed off, and even the author that quotes it says, well, she just had her expectations too high. See, no, it's not the explanation at all. The explanation is he's that kind of person, and Louisa May Alcott saw through him the instant that she saw him. See? So I don't know what else I need to do. I have a paper with all of this information that I submitted 5 months ago. At the 6-month mark, I'm going to write them and ask the status. If they don't want it, I send it to somebody else. I don't send it to any of the Dickens themed publications because they're all fan magazines. See, I mean, they're high-tone fan magazines, but basically they're fan magazines, and there's not a snowball's chance in hell that any of them would publish anything so damning about Dickens. I have to find another journal that's not specifically focused on Dickens. And then probably it's just a matter of it making the rounds and being rejected and putting people on notice, but it never actually gets published. So eventually, that's actually a better paper than the one that I have linked below. The one I have linked below was published by a very short-lived paranormal e-zine called Real Paranormal Magazine in England. And it's longer, and I mean, there's some flaws in it, but basically I just rewrote it, the shorter version, and sent that into a journal, and I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to the longer one, but I'll link it below this blog entry. And, you know, I'm not wrong about this. I've got way more evidence than I need, especially if you look a little more deeply into Mathew and Abby's life. But the thing is that what happens, I got on a Facebook group having to do with Edgar Allan Poe. And this is a group with a lot of people in it. And only like 2 or 3 people came forward to do battle with me using sophistry, which I get so tired of. And one of the guys read the paper, or said he did, but actually he only read like 2 pages, and he saw something about reincarnation and he got offended and he stopped reading and he dismissed it, see? Well, I told him, you'd better look and see what Henry David Thoreau said about the Bhagavad Gita in Walden before you go dismissing anything about reincarnation, you know? But basically, they wouldn't read it, see? And they made excuses for not having read it. Well, then I recently had an exchange with what I call a gatekeeper, somebody who was in charge of taking in submissions for a conference having to do with Charles Dickens. And I said, you need to read the paper, because I gave her the link. She says, oh, I read your paper, you know, like I read it and I, you know, don't see anything in it. And I said, you didn't read it, you know, you read 2 or 3 pages. And she never would say no, she had read the whole thing, but she kept going somewhere else. No, let's talk about this, you know. She wouldn't admit that she hadn't actually read the paper, and she lied to me and said that she had read it. See, so people don't read the whole paper. Every once in a while, back when I had the full tiered version of Academia EDU, their premier version, I could see how many pages people read. And every once in a while, I'd see somebody had read all 59 pages of the paper about Edgar Allan Poe. See, so once in a while, somebody would get it, and they'd read the whole thing, you know, but then they wouldn't write me. And that's a total disconnect. If you read that whole paper, there's extremely strong evidence, even stronger evidence that Mathew wrote The Raven than the evidence for Mathew and Abby having written A Christmas Carol. It's an open and shut case if you read the whole paper. And yet he didn't see fit to write to that person that had made that discovery. Why? You know, why would somebody read all 59 pages, absorb all of that evidence, see that it's obviously real, or at least it's certainly plausible, and not write the person? They're scared. The only thing I could think of is they're scared. I ain't going to touch this, you know. It's just a matter of time.